are starting a new unit today, and it is called Frontier Explorers. So, even though we're starting a new unit, it's really important that we remember all the things that we learned in our previous unit called A New Nation Declaring Independence, because the things that we're learning in this unit build on what we've already learned. So, before we get started on today's lesson, which is called Daniel Boone and the Opening of the West, we are going to review what we learned in our previous unit. So I want you to take a minute and I want you to look at these pictures, each of them, okay? And I want you to think, what is that a picture of? And then I want you to think, why might they be put in this order, okay? So take a second and think about what those pictures are and why they are in that order. All right, so we have a picture of the Native Americans. We have a picture of Christopher Columbus. We have a picture of the Pilgrims. And we have a picture of the Declaration of Independence. So the reason that they're in this order is because that's the order that they happened in. Okay, so remember that the Native Americans were the very first people known to live in North America. So they are first. Then we have Columbus, and Columbus came to North America after the Native Americans had already been living there for many, many years. So he's next. Then we have a picture of the Pilgrims, right? And the Pilgrims came to North America after Columbus did. The Pilgrims, remember, were one of the three settlements that came from Europe, okay? So we had Roanoke Island, which is also known as the Lost City in North Carolina. We had the Jamestown, which is in Virginia, and then we had the Pilgrims who were on Plymouth, Massachusetts, okay? Then after that, we have a picture of the Declaration of Independence, which shows that the colonists declared independence from Great Britain, and that is why the Revolutionary War started. Right? So in this unit, we are going to learn about how the United States grew and how this growth affected the Native Americans, the settlers, and the landscape, which just means the actual land. Today, we are going to hear about one of the very first explorers in the American West, Daniel Boone. I want you to listen carefully to find out one of the difficulties or challenges that Daniel Boone and other people who wanted to move west faced, okay? Today, people from all over the world live together in communities from one end of the North American continent to the other. From the Atlantic Ocean in the east to the Pacific Ocean in the west, and everywhere between. This map of North America shows the United States in green. You can see lots of thin white lines outlining the states that make up our country, the United States of America. However, hundreds of years ago, the map of the United States was much smaller than it is today. We learned that in our previous unit. Remember, in the previous unit, the 13 colonies were right here, right? Only on this side. And then this was not part of the United States yet. Only this part. Long, long ago, the only people who lived on the continent of North America were people now known as Native Americans. Native Americans have lived in North America for thousands of years. Native Americans lived in both seasonal and permanent villages. They used great knowledge of the land and its resources to create a great number of villages and cultures. At the same time, far away on the other side of the ocean, many other people had their own towns and villages. These people lived on the continent of Europe and were known as Europeans. So, here we go. All right. About 600 years ago, Europeans began to leave their lands and sail to other parts of the world seeking spices, gold, and other riches. Remember, Christopher Columbus had set out to look for spices, golds, and other riches, and a quicker way to India, but He didn't get there, did he? Some of these explorers arrived in North America, which is, next page. Imagine how surprised the Native Americans and Europeans must have been to see each other, people who looked, dressed, and spoke very differently from themselves. The early explorers who came to North America were mostly interested in finding goods and riches that they could take back to Europe and sell. Many of these explorers learned vital skills from Native Americans who knew the land very well. Vital skills are skills that are extremely important to someone's survival. Native Americans taught the Europeans many skills, including hunting, fishing, gathering, and farming. In exchange for their help, Europeans brought things to trade with the Native Americans, such as cloth. For many years, Europeans traveled back and forth across the Atlantic Ocean. Some Europeans were content, or satisfied, to just trade with the Native Americans, but others became interested in starting settlements because they wanted to live on the continent. Remember that we learned this from the other unit. Settlements are places where people make their homes in a new area, okay? The English started 2 early settlements in North America. In the 1600s, there was Plymouth in what is now known as Massachusetts, and Jamestown, which was what we now know as Virginia. At Plymouth, Native Americans helped the settlers survive. Do you remember how at Plymouth they celebrated their harvest together, the first Thanksgiving in America? The Europeans would not have been able to grow the corn or squash for that meal without the help from the Native Americans. As time passed, more and more Europeans came to live in North America, often encroaching on Native American land. That means they were taking the Native American land, okay? Fights over the land arose. Eventually, settlers claimed most of the land on the east coast of North America, land where the Native Americans had lived for many years. So when I say claimed, that means that the settlers said, this land belongs to us now, even though the Native Americans had been living on that land for thousands of years, okay? The English formed colonies or settlements controlled by faraway England, from Massachusetts all the way down to Georgia. So remember, they made those colonies, they started those colonies with Massachusetts being at the top, Georgia being at the bottom. And those colonies were controlled by Great Britain, okay, and the king. And that's pretty far away, but they were still being controlled by them, even though they were an ocean away. Daniel Boone was born in 1734 near the town of Reading, Pennsylvania. His father and mother owned a farm. Daniel and his brothers and sisters all helped their parents plow the fields on the farm. But Daniel was never content in the open fields. He was curious about life in the woods around their farm and spent as much time as possible creating paths through the forest. He made friends with young Native American boys who lived in the wooded areas. They taught Daniel how to move silently through the forest and how to trap wild animals and catch fish in the streams. Daniel learned how to use a knife and a tomahawk at an early age. His father, seeing how interested Daniel was in hunting, taught Daniel how to use a special type of gun called a rifle. It was common for people to learn hunting and survival skills during this time in history, which is very different from today. Today, most people have the option to buy food and other things rather than hunt for these resources by themselves. One day, while helping his father plow the fields, Daniel asked if he could be allowed to help out the family in another way. "Father," he said, "since you taught me to shoot a rifle, I have practiced and practiced until I am the best shot around for miles. Let me hunt for food for our family." Daniel's father agreed, and soon the Boones were feasting on wild turkey and deer. In 1750, just before Daniel turned 16, the Boone family moved from Pennsylvania to the Yadkin River Valley of North Carolina, settling at the edge of the frontier. It did not take long for the other settlers in his new home to discover that Daniel was one of the best woodsmen for miles around. Woodsmen are people who live or work in the forest. Daniel Boone lived and worked in the forest. Daniel began to explore his new surroundings. His explorations took him deep into the forests. He heard tales of buffalo to the west and wanted to try hunting other animals than the plentiful deer and bear that lived in the woods nearby. But Daniel was unable to go as far west as he wanted to go. Something was stopping him and the other settlers from traveling farther west. Can you guess what it was? There were enormous mountains standing in his way. These mountains are called the Appalachian Mountains, and they stretch for miles, from the present-day state of Maine all the way to Georgia. The mountains were heavily wooded, making them difficult to cross. They formed a natural barrier and blocked the movement from one side of the mountains to the other. For this reason, few European settlers had left the colonies along the eastern coast of North America to travel west. But Daniel knew that Native Americans had crisscrossed these mountains for years. As he roamed through the densely forested hillsides, his curiosity about lands to the west grew stronger. Daniel began to ask everyone he met if they knew of a way to cross the mountains. All right, where did Daniel Boone live? He first lived in Pennsylvania, and then he moved to North Carolina when he was 16. But he lived on the East Coast the whole time, right? Where did he want to go? He wanted to go out west, right? Do you know why he wanted to go out west? To explore and find new animals to hunt that he had heard about, right? He had heard about the buffalo, and he wanted to go and hunt them instead of just the deer and the turkey and the bear. What kept the English settlers from moving farther west across North America? That's right, the Appalachian Mountains. Do you see the mountains in this picture? Will you point to them? That's right, right here. You see how all those mountains are there? Those are the Appalachian Mountains. How would you describe Daniel Boone? He was a good hunter, and he was a woodsman, and he was curious about how to travel west across the Appalachian Mountains, right? He was so curious. He wanted to go over those mountains, and he wanted to explore. Do you think that Daniel Boone is going to find his way over the mountains? I guess we'll find out in later read-alouds, won't we? It is time for word work. In the read-aloud you heard, the Appalachian Mountains formed a natural barrier and blocked movement from one side of the mountain to the other. I want you to say the word barrier, okay? You can whisper talk it, monster voice it, mouse voice it, however you want. Go. Barrier. 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 A barrier is something that blocks movement from one place to another. A barrier can be natural or it could be man-made, meaning made by people. Here is an example of it used in a sentence. The police set up a barrier to block the road during the crime scene investigation. Have you ever encountered a barrier? If so, was it natural or man-made? I want you to try to use the word barrier when you tell about it. What's the word we've been talking about? Barrier, and a barrier is something that blocks movement from one place to another, and it can be natural or man-made. I'm going to describe something. If the item is something that is a barrier, I want you to say, that is a barrier. If the item is something that is not a barrier, I want you to say, that is not a barrier. Remember to answer in complete sentences and use the word barrier. A large, wide river with no bridge across. That's a barrier, right? Because you can't cross that river, really. I mean, you could swim, but I don't think that would really be that safe. It's a barrier. It's blocking you from getting to the other side, right? A piece of paper on the ground. That is not a barrier. If there was a piece of paper on the ground, you could step on it if you really wanted to. You could step over it if you really wanted to. It's not going to keep you from getting on the other side. How about construction barrels in the middle of the road? That is a barrier, right? You can't go through those. They're going to keep you from going. Okay. How about a tree that has fallen across a highway? That is a barrier. It would keep you from going down the road, right? How about a rug on the floor? That is not a barrier. The rug on the floor isn't going to keep you from walking around, right? All right, guys, that is the end of the read aloud. Check out what your assignment is, and I will talk to you next time. Bye.